Welcome to Nerdology, where we dive into the science behind consumer behavior, sensory research, and the latest hot topics in behavioral science. Quick insights, expert reviews, and conference highlights, all in bite-sized form. Let's get nerdy. Hi, everyone. Michelle Nagella here, and I just wanted to share with you the presentation that I gave at the International Society for Neurogastronomy just recently in August of 2025. I thought you might find it interesting, and I thought I'd make it accessible here. It was a really fun presentation to give. And here is a picture of myself giving this talk. As you can see, it's called The Cookie Stomach Theory, a neuroscientist journey into predicting food behavior with brains, behavior, and bots. And first, I talked about how I started my career in neuroscience studying the brain's mechanisms for food intake. So, like how hunger, satiety, and reward signals are processed. But the more I worked, the more I realized what happens in the lab is only part of the story. Out in the real world, food decisions are shaped by just as much by context and culture and emotion and environment as it is by biology. And that's where my work evolved. It evolved into connecting neuroscience with real world eating behavior and now using tools from behavioral science and AI to better predict and even design for the eating experiences people actually have. So, really settling into the idea of experiences and really how we all perceive things differently. And to start off this sort of discussion is this, I like to put up this quote, which is fear of being a failure is one of the most effective forms of freezing innovative thinking. Another is the fear of being successful. Now, I don't really put it up here for the content of the quote, although it is a great quote. Really, what I'm doing here is I then ask the audience to count the number of F's in this quote. And what is interesting is that if you give people a few moments to count the F's and they start trying to identify them, the ones that stand out to them are these F's. And so those people will say there's 8. So I will ask the audience how many people say there's 8, and hands will go up. And then I'll say 9, more hands will go up, and so on to 12 and even more. And the reason there's actually more is because they've forgotten these ones here in the pink. So there's actually 12. There is a correct answer, and that number is 12. But people start to see that other people in the audience are giving different numbers. And so the question is, why does this happen? Well, when people read of, they read it as a V instead of an F. And so their brain just sort of fills in that gap. So when they go to quickly count the number of F's, they will just kind of overlook all the ofs and instead end up with 8 instead of 12. So it's a really interesting play into understanding that we actually do all perceive things not necessarily as they truly are. So clearly, we aren't perfect. But our perceptions basically don't always reflect reality. For centuries, we've tried to explain human behavior and the differences among us. Plato, for example, imagined the soul as a chariot pulled by 2 horses, reason and desire, kept in balance by a rational mind. Freud gave us the id, ego, and superego, forever negotiating between instinct and morality. Kahneman described 2 systems of thinking, which is the fast and intuitive versus the slow and deliberate. And all the different models exist out there, but they do share a truth that our decisions are rarely purely rational. So, for example, one evening I was driving my daughter to dance class after a quick dinner. She said she was hungry, and I reminded her that she had just eaten. And without missing a beat, she said, "My dinner stomach is full, but my candy stomach only had one thing, and my cookie stomach is completely empty. I need a cookie." Now, she wasn't just making a joke. She was dead serious. She was describing exactly what she felt. And if you think about it, she's right. We all have different stomachs, or maybe different reward compartments for different foods. And so I asked my girls to draw this idea out because they are basically then this final theory of the way people think. And I asked my girls to draw this out, and they insisted to use Canva as they've gotten very excited about their ability to use that. But the presentation itself ended up being 15 slides long, and most of it looks something like this. So I'll spare you the long of it. But what I see them trying to tell me is that humans don't just eat for calories. We eat for craving, for context, for emotional reward. And that's where anticipation, reward, prediction, and the gap between logic and behavior really starts to come in. The human experience, perhaps, is what we should always be designing for. Because we do know that the experience of food, flavor, isn't just on the tongue, it's actually built in the brain. And there are different ways that we deal with the information coming in. Bottom up processing is more data driven, what your senses send in, color, aroma, texture, taste, and top down driven is more your expectations from past experiences and context. And these two forces actually work together every time we eat. And that's why eating with your eyes first is true. Visual cues like color, gloss, and shape set taste expectations, and those expectations can change what we actually perceive. Work from Mimi Morin's lab found that consumers have learned that unhealthy snacks such as potato chips tend to be sold in glossy packages, whereas healthier snacks such as crackers tend to be sold in matte packages, and that these cues can also drive our expectations. In other words, flavor ends up being a sum of sensory input, internal state, and our learned expectations. So now here's a quick clip of someone biting into a lime. Let me see if I can get that to play. Okay, it doesn't play, but you can kind of hear it a little bit. And apologies, it didn't play. But you can kind of get the idea that someone is squeezing a lime with their mouth, and you can just imagine the sound of it kind of crunching down and the sharp, sour flavor of this very juicy lime. You can probably already feel it in your jaw, maybe a little salivation starting. That's the top down and bottom up in perfect coordination. The visual and the sound cues trigger memories of sourness, and your body reacts as if the lime is already in your mouth. But when appearance clashes with expectation, like when you see something like a blue steak or green eggs and ham, our perception shifts. Consider green eggs and ham, for example. If you grew up with this book, you might find it whimsical and fun, or maybe slightly unsettling, because your brain is trying to match those colors to your learned expectations of eggs and ham. An expectation mismatch. Personally, I'm looking at those eggs and thinking, no, thank you, not hungry. But these examples show how the brain uses that sensory input and prior knowledge and emotion to shape flavor before we've even taken a bite, and sometimes when we never do. We eat what we expect, especially true when emotions get involved. Emotionally congruent eating means we choose foods that match how we feel or how we want to feel. Those patterns often start very early. So, if sweets once comforted us as children, consider ice cream after a breakup as a teenager or stress eating potato chips, that link can last a lifetime. Over time, the anticipation of that emotional payoff can drive the decision to eat, even without the hunger. The German term Kummerspeck literally translates to as grief bacon. So perhaps I'm not pronouncing that entirely correctly, but bear with me. It refers to this excess weight that's gained from emotional overeating, particularly when one is sad or experiencing grief. And it describes this physical manifestation of comfort eating, where individuals turn to food to cope with different emotions. Though I believe studies from Penn State actually disprove this effect. The notable exception, women predisposed to emotional eating are more likely to report weight gain post-breakup. So, research even links higher sugar and fat intake to greater impulsivity and compulsive behaviors. So, think of repetitive behaviors like trichotillomania, where people pull their hair out, or skin picking, where some people report changes in urges when they just adjust their diet. So, food can definitely have that link to emotion. And that brings me back to the cookie stomach theory, because just like my daughters separate dinner stomach and cookie stomach, we're not simply eating for fuel, we're eating for a specific reward we expect. And that expectation can steer behavior as much as any physical craving. So when it comes to food, our choices aren't simple or purely rational, as described by Plato and Freud and Kahneman and even the Nigella girls, right? They're shaped by a complex mix of personal, social, and environmental factors. We all have our own preferences that can be shaped by culture, our upbringing, and our lived experience. There are also practical realities like what's affordable and what's available and what's just easy to get. Then there are the internal drivers like taste, hunger, mood, emotion. We might choose the same food for comfort one day and then, like cake, for example, and then celebration for the next day. Ooh, a birthday, right? So, what actually drives choice? It's not just one thing, it's the way all these forces interact within a moment. And that moment is where craving, context, and decision making begin to collide. So, how can we predict what people want to eat? Well, here's a picture of Michael Nestrud, who some of you may know. He's on the first page of images that come up when I Google image searched sensory scientist. So, yay for Michael. And I suppose that's what my algorithm tells me is a sensory scientist. And it would be interesting to see if your algorithm is a little bit different. But anyway, so here we have Michael setting up a sensory discrimination panel study, relying on a panel of trained tasters to assess some juices. In these types of panels, we rely on humans to be trained and act as machines to describe and discriminate among stimuli. And a big question within industry these days is surely AI can't replace everyone. People are still going to have to taste things, right? That is a very human experience, particularly generative AI and LLMs, which are being used to model and create synthetic data based on human behavior, what it's finding on the internet, for example. Even digital twins that mimic what we may actually do based on our own personal health data, right? So now in Thomas Nagel's famous 1974 essay, Nagel argues that conscious experience is actually inherently subjective, that there's something it is like, for example, to be a bat. But no matter how much objective science we can collect about bats, like how they hear with echolocation, the different brain activity they might have, the different behaviors they have, their biological makeup, genetics, everything. We can't truly know what it feels like to be a bat from the bat's own perspective. This raises the question of whether consciousness or subjective experience can ever be fully explained by all those physical processes, like in neuroscience research, for example, or even by artificial ones alone, but potentially also about what we think we know about human experience from more traditional measures like these descriptive panels. So this challenges the idea that objective measurement equals full understanding, though arguably objective measurement is what sensory science and neuroscience are all about. And as you can see, this starts to become a journey that I experienced having gone from, originally my interest was very psychology based and trying to look at things from a very fluid perspective, and then going into neuroscience and wanting things to be very concrete. But then here I am starting to see that objective measurement is not exactly full understanding. We need to hear from actual humans what their experiences are and in their own words. So I thought I'd play this out. And here's something interesting that I presented at ACAMS earlier this year, where I asked 5 different popular and available LLMs to tell me about durian. So I asked it some questions. What does durian taste like? How would a sensory scientist explain what a durian tastes like? So a slightly different take. And I'd like to know more to help me contextualize for someone that has never heard or experienced a durian before. And they all came up with similar but nuanced answers. And of course, I used AI to summarize their differences in personalities and their responses. But with all the knowledge about durian in the world being assessed, can AI know what it truly tastes like to be a durian, to taste a durian? Can AI be used to model and predict what something will taste like with all the data? Like, what is it like to be a bat? And you can see here, there's some interesting responses. So durian tastes like a sweet, creamy custard with funky, savory notes. I like this one. If you blended a banana cream pie with caramelized onions and a touch of garlic butter, but served it chilled, you'd get close. A sensory scientist would explain durian as a fruit whose taste is complex. So this is very, yeah, this is pretty accurate. But then you have this one, like walking past a bakery that's next to a garbage dump. Some focus on the bakery and others can't get past the dump. Or if an avocado, a creme brulee, and a caramelized onion had a baby, that's durian. So some interesting responses here that do sound very human-like. And they all came up with these different things. And you can see here there were different styles also that I was able to sort of get the LLM to then compare them and see what the differences were. So ChatGPT tended to be more conversational, whereas Claude tended to be a lot more neutral and scientific. DeepSeek tried to balance the two. So you can kind of see that things were a little bit different among the different LLMs. Now, my friend Tian Yu is a digital sensory and consumer scientist, and she has a PhD in neuroscience with expertise in texture and taste. And we've talked for years about what's missing in most prediction models for product success. And we agree. The thing that's missing is the human. So instead of mapping markets by price or brand, Tian decided to analyze over 10,000 Amazon chip reviews in consumers' own words that they actually put within their reviews. And she was able to map these out. The clusters that emerged weren't about price points, they were about experiences, which is pretty interesting. So things like light and airy pop snacks, classic indulgent chips, healthy veggie options, even like a sweet pita chip, as outliers. It gave a lot of interesting insight into the descriptions that people gave. This approach, using AI and consumer reviews, gives us a good example of using unstructured consumer language as sort of a third pillar of sensory research. So, alongside the panels and the surveys, we can let AI uncover the deeper drivers of choice because to predict behavior, technology has to start with the human experience. So, I actually asked Tian what she thinks about the durian tasting thing that we just went over and where things are going. And she said that I don't believe it is impossible for a whole life experience to live in a model or a digital twin. It's not you. You're still with your life. But yes, it's not entirely impossible. So I believe that these approaches can be used to test out different ideas, but perhaps shouldn't totally replace asking humans, at least not yet. But the idea of using AI to pilot data may not be a bad idea when trying to improve research designs. But that's a talk for a different day. The way we ask the question, our prompting, is really the most important thing. And here's some more data that she looked at with something slightly different. And so in this mapping, she was looking for different trends by analyzing podcast transcripts to look for, food and beverage trends. And some interesting things that actually came out was the idea that 7-Elevens, the Taiwanese or Japanese style 7-Elevens, are actually a really interesting upcoming trend within the US that is kind of moving over. So being able to track those trends by doing this sort of mapping could be a really interesting way to get further insights. So, what can we actually do with this understanding of anticipation and preference and AI and prediction? First, we can nudge healthier choices by designing foods that feel emotionally and sensorially satisfying, not just nutritionally better. When people are faced with uncertainty in a food choice, they often resort to heuristics, like we did with counting of the F's, right? Basing our expectations on appearance, texture, and aroma to help them decide if something is even edible. We can also use AI to explore variability across people, test new ideas quickly, and move beyond designing for beverages, or sorry, for averages. AI may be able to help us think in terms of individual experiences and not just group trends if we can use it in a really the right way. More importantly, we can start to predict not just what people like, but what they'll want to like next. So these things can be based on memory, mood, and context because taste isn't fixed. It changes depending on how we feel, what we expect, and even how tired or stressed we are. Taste always belongs to the perceiver, as it said. That's why we need to embrace complexity and not just try to reduce people to some sort of one size fits all metric. Instead, just measuring overall liking, we can design sort of for the experience, the parts people notice and ultimately remember. These are the cues that drive stronger responses and repeat purchases. So, this is the opportunity to design food that works not just nutritionally, but experientially by tapping into memory, emotion, and the full sensory picture. So back to the cookie stomach, my daughter's logic that night just wasn't entirely wrong. She was actually predictively precise. She knew exactly which kind of reward she was still looking for. And that's the point. Understanding preference isn't really about what's on the plate. It's about what's in the mind before the bite. It's the anticipation, the expectation, and the learned associations that steer behavior. So then I was saying that if you were going to be coming to Pangborn, you could hear the next talks that I gave about these sort of learned associations, and I'm going to post that one as well. But overall, this talk kind of leaves you with this question. What other stomachs are we missing when we try to change how people eat? And if we could identify those stomachs, how might that change the way we design food, flavor, and eating experiences to fill them? So with that, I thanked everybody, invited people for questions, and we had a lot of really great discussions. Some of my favorite moments from the experience was having gone to a restaurant later in the week, and a woman came up to me to let me know that while her dinner stomach was full, her wine stomach was very empty, and she was looking forward to filling it. So some really good fun that we were able to have.